Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Mustafa Ahmad. I'm a policy analyst with the climate change program at MDE. I'll be moderating this afternoon session. Thank you to everyone for joining the fifth session of the Alternative Fuels and Technologies Working Group. We're super excited to continue this working group for stakeholders across both the building energy performance standards and the clean heat rules. As usual, this session will be recorded and uploaded to the Maryland Department of the Environment's BEPS YouTube playlist and Clean Heat Rules YouTube playlist. We'll share a link to the slides in the description of the video after it's posted to both of our YouTube playlists. For this session, since we're inviting a more openly formatted dialogue, the chat will be enabled. So please feel free to send any comments or questions that you have there. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce one of our team members that's on the call, Dr. Zach Berzola, aka Dr. Decarb, the head of the building decarbonization team within the climate change program. Zach, you want to say a few words?
Good afternoon, everyone. We're glad you joined us today for this discussion, and I look forward to getting into it.
Awesome. Thanks, Zach. Without further ado, let's get started. So for those of you who've joined us before, this slide will be pretty familiar, but those of you who are joining us for the first time, the purpose of this working group is to create a consistent, scientifically based assessment of the life cycle emissions impacts of alternative fuels and technologies, and just thinking how we can apply those under the framework of Maryland's building decarbonization policies. Additionally, as I hope will become evident in this session, we're here to solicit stakeholder input to inform the exact development of this framework. If you're looking for more in-depth details about BEPS or the clean heat rules than what we highlight today, we would point you to previous webinars and technical documentation that are currently available for viewing on the department's BEPS and clean heat websites. The QR codes for both of those websites are available over here. I'll take a moment just for anyone who wants to capture these QR codes. I think we'll also be dropping the links. Thanks, Sam. We're dropping the links in the chat as well, so you can easily access it. All right. So as I mentioned before, for this meeting, we're taking a more open format approach where we'll have a facilitated but open discussion to note and explore topics that are relevant to you all. Now, before this meeting, we sent out a pre-feedback form to get a sense of what topics were most on people's minds. And big thanks to everyone who participated, who responded, who sent supporting documentation to that end. We gathered all the topics we received input on, grouped them, categorized them into overall themes that we'll go into a little bit more detail throughout this presentation and throughout this discussion process. So we had some general feedback about, and questions around GREET, certain criteria that goes into the life cycle emissions analysis process, other alternative fuels of interest, compatibility with electricity and electrification goals, technologies like air-to-water heat pumps, siting opportunities and challenges with fuels, other technologies, and other topics as well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zach to get us started with some of this discussion.
All righty. So let's dive in. I'm hoping to not be talking a lot today. My goal is just to kind of touch on a couple of things that were for open discussion based off everyone's questions and topics that were put in. And then I've structured this so that after usually about 1 or 2 slides of a little bit of content and material based on what folks have asked about, we'll take a pause for discussion. So that was one of the pieces of feedback we heard from all of you, is that folks wanted more time to discuss. And just to, what we said, if you want to come in and bring a point, raise your hand, and then we'll call on you to come off mute. We've changed the settings a little bit in this one, so all you have to do is just push the mute button yourself. We'll try that out. If it becomes unruly, doesn't work very well today, we can switch back. Just remember, once you've come off mute, come back, please put the mute back on so we don't hear background noise. That's our biggest concern when we're doing these webinars. All right, so diving in, where we've been through this process, we've been talking about how to develop a life cycle emissions rate approach, as Mustafa said in the previous slides. So the University of Maryland presented last time. They provided some pretty and also provided some clarifications on how what they proposed last time worked. So I just want to talk about this. What we're looking for is on the left side of the screen, life cycle emissions rates. And so what that entails is two pieces. It looks like somebody's off mute. If you're, would everyone just please check if they're muted? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. And so you basically, there's two different pieces. There's the combustion emissions. That's usually derived from authoritative sources like the EPA's emissions factors for combustion emissions of a fuel. And then there's the upstream emissions, where we're trying to estimate the life cycle emissions of that fuel and the kind of sources and sinks that go into that. And so one of the industry standards is GREET. We kind of put that out there as our planned tool for doing this analysis. We've been hearing support from folks to do that. So at this point, that's kind of what we're setting up to do. And so the University of Maryland presented last time, and what they presented last time, because we got a couple questions about this, was the upstream emissions rate. So just that lower box. So the values they shared were just looking at the outputs of the GREET model on upstream emissions. They had yet to put combustion emissions into a full life cycle emissions rate. So we're still, the whole goal of their presentation last time was to bring everyone up to speed on what a GREET analysis looks like. And so that's kind of what they were working on, and we'll be working in a future meeting to present some more results and bringing it to that life cycle emissions rate fully as well. And just again, for a little bit of how this workflow is going to go, UMD is going to do some work, get the default, use a lot of default assumptions or pretty clear assumptions for here in Maryland. We'll present those results at a future working group. We'll take feedback, and then kind of gather input from folks on different inputs to the model that they want considered as we set up the kind of standard approach and inputs for Maryland's GREET. And then we will then do a revision to that modeling, have UMD rerun scenarios, and come out with a final report. And that final report is going to be based on these standard scenarios that we'll talk about later, as well as a methodology and the assumptions. So that's to come. Now, one of the questions we got last time was kind of, is GREET attributional or consequential? And questions of, could we get this process to be consequential? And so we did some digging in the interim, and ultimately GREET is an attributional tool. It is really actually quite challenging to make a consequential tool. And the reason we use GREET and folks around the country are using GREET is it's standardized and it's very open. It's a spreadsheet. You set the assumptions, you put the inputs in, and you get results, and you can share that and see that, and it can be consistent across many different jurisdictions. The challenge with consequential models is that they're very tied into specific modeling and assumptions outside of a GREET tool. You would have to have whole additional processes running on top of it. So as we've been digging into this, what we are leaning to is that we're going to stick with the basic GREET model, because that's what's most repeatable. It's also the easiest if, as we've talked about before, if a heating fuel provider wants to go and prove out their own fuel pathway that is different than the handful of standard ones that the state's going to first develop here, it's relatively straightforward to be using that GREET model to do it. Whereas it could take a year of study to do a consequential model. And so that's kind of where we are starting to land on that front. And I think that's, I'm definitely open to feedback on that part as well, but just wanted to share that that was kind of an open thread from last time. So if we go to the next slide, I've started to say some of this already. We're planning to use the GREET model for life cycle emissions calculations of all fuels. Those first draft results are coming. I got ahead of myself. And we'll be asked for additional data, and then we'll publish these representative pathways. And so that's the kind of key pieces here. And as we've gone here to the next slide, you can see that our goal is really developing pathways that can be credited if those life cycle emissions can be modeled in GREET, and if there's a change from the default assumptions that we've been set, you can justify it, right? If you've got to use the default assumptions but just have a different feedstock, that's a pretty straightforward one. If you're having different assumptions along the way, there's going to have to be some additional justification of why this thing is different. So somebody asked, what if we wanted to use a lower carbon feedstock like a cover crop to go into a biodiesel blend or something like that? And the answer is, that's something that's possible, and that's why we are like the GREET model. Is if you can justify, well, this is a different piece of feedstock, a different input, here's the data showing why this input is different than what the standard assumption is, then we can use it and kind of justify moving forward with that. A couple of other key things. So we've kind of, I think, over the last few sessions talked a lot about the kind of some of the challenges with avoided carbon, with carbon emissions in general, and kind of the challenges in other jurisdictions where it feels like avoided emissions are being overly credited. And I think that's been a challenge. We've actually heard a lot of good feedback from you all, both on, there's challenges in other jurisdictions where they're being overly credited, and others saying, well, GREET is the standard, and let's use GREET as it is said. If GREET says this is the carbon intensity, we should use GREET's value. And that's kind of, both of those are really valid in pieces of feedback. And we've been working our way through that. And really what we're starting to hear and think about is, instead of trying to go and make all sorts of adjustments, let's try to stick with the core thing of GREET. It's a national model and it works in other jurisdictions. But let's think about the things that are really important to us here in Maryland. For example, if you've got if there's avoided emissions reductions were you basically only giving credit to avoided emissions reductions that would have otherwise been lawfully released and instead are recaptured. So let me say that one more time, because that's a mouthful. Basically, we've got to draw a boundary around this, and we say if there's avoided emissions that would have otherwise happened, and would have otherwise happened legally, and not just, oh, we weren't enforcing or something like that, then there was no law saying you couldn't emit that, then, and you're recapturing that, that's true avoided emissions for the state of Maryland, or for our what we're looking at here. And so that's kind of a key thing that we've been thinking about and think might be a bit of the compromise to try to get us into a place that works for everybody. The other key thing, that this fuel has to be delivered to Maryland for use. That end user is going to have to own that fuel and retire any renewable attributes. So you can't be double counting things in clean heat here that you're valuing with GREET for some other program, some other requirement. So all of these kind of key things to really help bring us into a place where we really are spurring what we want, which is a bioenergy economy here in Maryland and the surrounding regions that does actually deliver biofuels into Maryland and leads to actual additional contributions to our emissions reductions. So that's kind of where we're thinking. And wanting to make sure that we're actually leading to additionality with what we're getting here under this program. And again, I've said this a couple of times, but I just wanted it in writing, because we keep getting feedback about this saying, oh, we'd like to look at this pathway and we'd like to look at this pathway. And our goal is, yes, all those pathways, if you can model it in GREET, we should be able to do the analysis, review it, check it against these couple of key principles. And that's the kind of thing that get credited. We, MDE, cannot run every different permutation, and we don't want to lock us in in case there's innovation in the future for different pathways, or I think I've given this example before, but say you've got the standard default assumption assumes that you've got biofuel coming from halfway across the country, it's grown out there, it's refined another halfway between there and here, and then it's delivered all the way to Maryland. Versus a biofuel that's grown on the Eastern Shore at a biorefinery on the Eastern Shore that's delivered to houses in the Eastern Shore. That is going to be very different in terms of its life cycle emissions, or it will be different in terms of its life cycle emissions compared to the former. And so if our kind of standard pathway is more of a national average or Maryland semi-specific, that Eastern Shore one might go and get its own pathway certified to say, hey, we're a better brand of this kind of biofuel, and we want to credit that. So what we're proposing is to provide a template of, here are the things you need to do. Use this GREET model. Here are the inputs and default assumptions, and then do the analysis if you want some non-standard pathway and prove out why you're different in certain areas. I just spoke a lot, which I was going to try to not do, so I'm going to take a pause here for discussion. And I will just note the next, I was trying not to go too many slides talking, so the next thing we'll talk about is we got feedback on a couple of different potential pathways that folks wanted to. We've looked into all of them and have a report back on, how can it be done in GREET, and actually some links to share if that was you and want to dive into how other jurisdictions have used GREET. So I'm going to take a pause there and we'll go to questions.
Tony, looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have one question about avoided emissions and whether, I know in California there's been some issues around negative, fuels that have negative values, and that, distorting some of the low carbon fuel standard out there. And I'm wondering where Maryland will be in terms of whether fuels can actually have negative emission values, or whether the lowest value is 0 for an alternative fuel.
Yeah, Tony, good question. And I was kind of referencing it maybe a little opaquely. We've kind of gotten comments from folks saying, 0 needs to be the bottom. We've heard from other folks saying, well, if GREET's saying it's more than 0, it's or less than 0 because it's got some negative emissions, we're avoiding emissions, not just canceling them out, then we should be quantifying that. And I think, I'm at the moment also waiting a little bit to see how some of these draft results come out, so that we can really better understand it. But the thinking is, at least as we've been hearing all this feedback, is that by putting some of those principles I shared, those principles will help bring the solution set of what qualifies down to things that are really leading to additional emissions reductions, whereas what we've seen in a lot happening in other states is that sometimes we're just getting credit for things that were already happening or are being added because of the program in terms of sources of emissions. And so we're trying to avoid that while still trying to value the benefits that some of these fuels might be bringing in terms of sequestering carbon. Does that make sense, Tony?
Yeah. So just to clarify, so with those principles, like if methane were captured at a dairy in some other state, reducing, that methane was a reduction, and you could get a negative value for that, and that fuel were then shipped to Maryland, then we're not seeing any of the air quality benefits here in Maryland, et cetera. But there's just been some challenges of that. And like you said, that any lawfully, where the emissions were lawful, is that lawful in Maryland or lawful where they were emitted? That doesn't give a lot of room for Maryland to look at other options for controlling methane release from agricultural sources.
Yeah, Tony, that's a great question. I think we are as currently envisioning a little bit broader than just in state. So if there were out of state sources, it's creditable, but it does have to get delivered here to Maryland. and that's kind of the key. So it's not going to be crossing the country. In most cases. I mean, it could, I guess, in a tanker truck potentially. I mean, that just seems economically inefficient. I do agree that we do have this challenge of the air quality, of the air emissions here in Maryland, not necessarily reflecting that, but it is kind of trying to find somewhere in the middle here. I think we're open to continuing to have that discussion, but that's where we're kind of finding ourselves at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Steve, so you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Doctor, for this presentation. Where or does ILUC come into play in this whole assessment?
Yeah, and that's indirect land use change. Is that am I correct in the?
Yes, yeah, indirect land use.
Yeah. So basically, GREET does account for some of those pieces in the analysis. So one of the inputs in GREET is kind of how much land use change is happening. And so that would get accounted for in the GREET analysis. And this is one of those things, if I'm not mistaken, where we're going to have kind of, here's the default assumptions from GREET, and we'll be providing kind of the list of all the default assumptions and where it is. And we can then have that discussion about if folks are like, well, this is a national average, but here's a much better data set for Maryland or for the states around Maryland where we're most likely to get this fuel from.
Thank you.
Bert, I see you have your hand up, but Zach, just before that, we do have a question in the chat from Joanne Ivancic asking if a new data center uses renewable diesel in its emergency generators instead of petroleum under current laws, it can get credit for carbon reduction. But if the law changes and renewable diesel or similar biofuels are used and the requirement is to use these fuels, then the data center only gets credit for complying with the requirement and is not eligible for any other carbon credit programs.
Oh boy, there's a lot there. All right, I gotta read that one more time. Sure. Yeah, I think, well, so this is an interesting one. Where this is talking about where I was talking about the kind of avoided emissions piece is all about the kind of fuel production, the feedstock. So Joanne, this is a little bit different. I think you're talking more about the kind of back end of the actual emissions coming out the stack. It's slightly different, and we can think about this a little bit more. But the idea is that, you know, if it was, you're not allowed to release methane from this source, right? Hypothetical, there's a law that says you cannot release methane from this source. And that methane is being released, even though it's illegal to do so. You couldn't get clean heat credits for capturing that methane and delivering it to Maryland for consumption. Like, that does not lead to additional lawful emissions reductions. But if instead that source of methane was going to be a source of methane, whether, you know, and is legally allowed to be a source of methane into the atmosphere, and we're instead capturing that and using it, that then is a creditable avoided emissions of the kind of original source of the fuel. Maybe that helps clarify a little bit.
So maybe let me clarify a little more. What I'm thinking is, in one of the slides you talked about the end user, that the end user would be the one to retire the credits. So if that end user is that data center, then I was thinking, are they the ones that have some obligation to retire those credits, or if there's no obligation, then do they get some kind of, you know, could they participate in a voluntary carbon credit thing, or, you know, what requirement will there be if there's a state requirement that you use renewable fuel for something, then they have to, then that, it was like that end user question that I guess I was trying to ask about.
Yeah, I can't talk about any hypothetical state regulation in terms of that front of it, but I can say, right, if a user right here, you're giving an example of a data center. If a user uses one of these fuels, the renewable attributes have to be retired, right? Somebody else can't be buying the renewable fuel, the RIN, for example, if there's a methane gas, can't be buying that RIN in a different marketplace and claiming credit for it, right? It has to be, this is renewable fuel being used in this, and being used by somebody, and its renewable attributes are being retired by that end user. So therefore, it cannot be credited. In order for it to be counted as a renewable fuel, it can't be credited in some other program. Does that make sense?
I'll work on that.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bert, so you have your hand up.
Hi, I got a question, and it's about carbon capture. How does carbon capture locally, I see you're smiling because there are no regulations on it yet, affect the fact that, well, that reduces carbon, captures the emissions. So how do you see that playing into this thing?
Bert, I'm also smiling because it's one of the things that's been on the agenda for this working group, but we haven't quite gotten to it yet because we've been down the GREET rabbit hole. And right now, unless you know of something, I'm not sure that GREET has specific. Actually, it might. We're still digging. Let me say this: we're digging into it. I'm planning for that to be on the topic of discussion for the next working group, because it's a little bit of a diversion from where we are right now on the fuel side, but it is meant to be, right. If we are capturing, just taking the 30,000 foot view in what this working group is all about, if we are capturing the emissions, right, capturing the emissions and permanently storing them, and then the life cycle emissions of something has gone down. And so we do want to credit that under the framework we're developing here. We're just trying to figure out the right way to do the accounting math, because I don't think we have not seen any good examples so far, but we're doing more digging on people using GREET to do that.
GREET,
or other tools. Yeah.
If I understand it, if you humor me for a couple follow-ups here. GREET is looking at the source of the production of biofuels, or whatever for that matter. And then it's measuring it as it relates to the end user that is in a different place. That'd be a fair way to say it.
Yes.
Therefore, if you had normally produced fuels and you captured the emissions at the point of use, the only thing left would be the emissions to get it from point A to point B.
Yep.
Would that be a fair way to look at it?
Yeah. So it would basically, if, hey, Mustafa, can we go back to slide 5? In this figure, basically, you'd be saying, right, in the carbon capture scenario, we'd be kind of cutting out this combustion emissions box here.
That's right.
And there would just be left over the upstream emissions, because so GREET has both we're talking about biofuels, but also the kind of just a standard, diesel or natural gas. So we can use, the idea is we're still using the different pieces of it, but you would be saying, cut out this combustion emissions part of it.
That's right. And one might make the further leap, and I haven't that closely studied it, but I've done energy for a long time, that if you're looking at something produced somewhere else and it gets here and it's gas traveling in a gas pipeline, the effect's going to be the same upstream except for the production of it. You know, the transportation of it effect should be the same because it's still getting transported, right? Methane's getting transported somewhere. I'm just wondering, that is how this model should work, right? It's whatever it is to produce, whatever it is to transport, and whatever it is when you burn it.
Yep.
I'm grossly simplifying, but
Yeah, simplified broad strokes, exactly. Yes.
okay. All right. And hence my question, local carbon, yeah, you got to do some more work to figure out how to work it in here. But if you capture carbon locally, it would stand to reason to have a positive impact on this calculation. It's something we would like people to do.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Good enough. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your questions.
Zach, we got another question in the chat. Sorry, one second, just disappeared on me for a sec. The question is, why is there a willingness to do additional work on avoided emissions but not consequential GREET?
So I would say that from our perspective, there's not necessarily a lot of additional work on unavoided emissions. It is being captured in GREET. In order to submit a pathway, it must be, lawful to be emitted. And that's just a kind of a going into GREET before we do the analysis, what needs to be the case. So at least that's how we're thinking about it. If there's something I'm missing, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I'm thinking, as Tony is writing about, in terms of enforcement and the counterfactuals. I mean, all of those are very legitimate questions, and I don't think, for instance, California got that right, and others have missed the boat. And just worried that MDE will have a difficult time measuring this. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's noted, and we will continue to think and stew on this one and continue to talk about it. All right, let's move to the next. Let's go to the next slide. So we put these up because this is what folks asked for. And so we had additional alternative fuels of interest that folks were curious about. And so we did our homework. And I just want to walk through each of these and talk to you about it. So the first one is wastewater renewable natural gas. As we mentioned, so this is something that is, basically it is doable in GREET. There is an example from Argonne National Labs, who actually develops GREET, about wastewater RNG and how to do how it's calculated in GREET. So I'm gonna put it in the chat, just again so we have everything here. This is the source of an example of doing it. And again, as I mentioned before, we're not at MDE going to run a calculation for wastewater RNG because there's so many different options. Again, we could make this list a mile long of all the different pathways, but if it's available to be calculated in GREET, we can show you examples where it's being done already, and that would be a way to put that in the future. So the next one is biodiesel. Someone commented about soybean base. So if that was you, we actually presented on that at the University of Maryland. Dr. Fung presented on that last week, or last session a month ago. So that is something that we are actually developing a standard pathway for as one of our options. And so that is kind of, that one is, again, we'll have a standard pathway. If there's specific things that make this one different than the standard pathway, you could submit it. The other one in the biodiesel was a question about tallow and animal fats. That is also possible. There is I realized I didn't have the link. I just have the citation. but I'll drop it in the chat, and if we can find the citation, we can do that. But tallow and animal fats is something that has been done in GREET, and that is the citation that I just dropped in the chat. So again, is possible. Before I go on, I saw somebody asking about landfill renewable natural gas. Yeah, that is a good question. And the one there is a little bit, that could be a little more nuanced depending on the regulations around that landfill. So certain, and this is not my area of expertise, but there are, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, there are certain landfills that are required to already capture and dispose of and handle the methane being emitted. If that is the case, they are not already allowed to emit it. You can still use that. That is, it's methane, but you wouldn't necessarily get credit if it was not legally, if back to this legal question, right? Could it have been emitted in the first place? So that's kind of where that comes in. I mean, and in other parts of the, in other places as well. But so the question there, the answer there is it depends, I think, a little bit. But yes, in theory, that those kinds of sources can be run through. So the next one was renewable propane. And again, renewable propane, this is good. I'm going to sound like a broken record. We found a result. We found a study that looked at this. And I'm going to drop it. Oh, perfect. Mustafa's one step ahead of me. Perfect. So we found a study basically showing that you could do it, and that is available in GREET today. And then finally, a question around biofuels from woody biomass. And we also found a study that showed 3 different pathways. Willow, poplar, and forest residue are all available in GREET today. Actually, were available 10 years ago in GREET. So you can see this presentation from Argonne 10 years ago about how it was done. And it seems like they've also done a few minor improvements in the interim as well. So the answer to everybody that asked in our pre-survey about, what about this fuel is yes. All these fuels can be done in GREET. And it's why we're feeling like GREET really is the place to be, because as we keep getting asked, can we do this? Can we do that? The answer is yes. We can evaluate it in GREET, and anyone can, because it's a spreadsheet. It is you can go and download it from Argonne right now and go and use it. With that, next slide, Mustafa, discussion, questions about what we just talked about. Or thoughts, concerns?
Yeah, Gregory.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
So just wondering procedurally, is it correct to say that if there is an alternative fuel that is not currently on the list you've provided, but it is already included in GREET, then in the future we could use that fuel pathway?
Yes, that's the idea. You would basically go in and show, yes, and fill out the information to show and register that fuel pathway is the idea to get the credits.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Again, with the caveat of, as we're kind of working through this group, there are a handful of principles that we want to make sure that is followed as we do that. Yeah, Joanne, I was just reading your question in the chat as well.
Yeah, I guess it's basically sort of a variation on the theme that I was asking about before.
Yes. Yeah. No, I think the answer to your question here is yes, right? If and again, this is where I'm not an expert on the landfill methane regulations, but this is a good kind of exemplar case, right? If, for example, that methane was required to be avoided, is supposed to not be emitted, then you could not get that credit in Maryland for the avoided life cycle emissions. Oh, yes, in theory, somebody else might, right? This is the challenge that has been raised about other jurisdictions being fairly easy to get avoided emissions credits. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. Does that help answer your question?
I really wasn't even thinking about other states. I was just thinking, so say here we're in Frederick, and the landfill or the wastewater treatment plant under Maryland law has to, or under the local law, already has an obligation to capture that and not let it be admitted there, right? You're going to capture it and you're going to put it into the pipeline or into the grid or something like that. So they meet that obligation. That it's a whole different thing. So and then they sell it to a company to to use for whatever their natural gas for heat or power in their building. That company certainly should be able to legitimately say, we're using green methane, we're using landfill methane, we're making an effort to not use fossil natural gas. And that would still be a legitimate thing for them to say, even though if they have some kind of requirement under Maryland law to be decreasing their carbon footprint, it's not going to count to that.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Let's go to the next one. Electricity. Lots of thoughts and interest on this one. We got a lot of questions about the treatment of heat pumps and other electric systems and how that factors in, making sure that there's kind of a level playing field between an alternative fuel and making sure that kind of all play together. And so wanted to just provide some little bit of a deeper dive here on how electricity is handled, and the plan is to use GREET and some of the kind of projections on future of electric mix in Maryland to look at life cycle emissions rates for electricity use as well. So we're evaluating life cycle emissions on all the fuels. The electricity would also be evaluated on a life cycle emissions rate. So the way that we might evaluate a heat pump, for example, in a house would be, hey, it's going to save you 5 tons of emissions over the baseline in the next, per year for the next 15 years, but it's producing through the electricity 1 ton of emissions. So you're going to get credit, just like you might get credit for alternative fuel, of 4 tons of emissions reductions this year, and for the next 15 years. Maybe it changes over time, but just kind of trying to keep it a little simple. So that's the way that we're thinking about how that would work. And basically, electricity is essentially a scored fuel, so you can do in a life cycle emissions rate and do the calculations as well. And I'll note also, because this was another kind of question somebody asked, and I think just like we were saying, if you have a default assumption, if we take a default assumption, but you have a alternative, you could say, well, hey, I put in that heat pump and I installed, solar panels that I've retired the RECs for just to deliver the electricity for this heat pump. And that's a new installation. And so now I'm actually getting zero, my electricity emission should be zero if you're matched up or something like that, right? Like that's the idea. Then you could go out and say, here's this custom way of saying, oh, I've got a nice matchup. And therefore my electricity emission should be zero for this thing. So that's kind of the thinking that we've got going there. then now we're into discussion. So yeah, we can definitely. Tony, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just wanted to check. So is that life cycle emissions of for the fuel saving? So that would depend on like what fuel you're replacing and all the upstream emissions for that gas or fuel oil or propane.
Yep.
Is that true? Okay. And then in terms of the electricity, you know, I know there's questions around like, are you using the average emissions intensity of the grid versus the marginal emissions versus, you know, and so like, do you have a specificity there, or that would be determined?
We are in the midst of these conversations right now in about 3 different venues. So we're working with the PSC and Empower as they're looking at the emissions rates over there, and so we're trying to align all of these emissions rates across the state. So there is a standard set of assumptions, and so I don't actually have an answer for you on like what the emissions factors are yet. That's very much in process in about 3 different places.
Okay.
But we're looking to Empower in many ways as kind of setting the kind of benchmark in regards to this.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm following those conversations there. I just want to make sure that they were going to be similar or at least coordinated in some way. That's great.
Yep.
Thanks.
We got a question in the chat, Zach. How's MD thinking about solar used on farmland when evaluating impacts?
If you don't mind, that is the topic of a few slides from now. So I am going to, if that's all right, Jill, I will bring it up when we get to that slide and we can discuss it there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Let's move to the next one. We got asked about heat pumps. A stakeholder asked us how heating a building with a hot water heat pump could work. And again, this goes to that last question of how could you credit something like that in this program? And so the idea here is, well, first of all, I just wanted to do a quick primer. Air to water heat pumps, there's kind of 2 different kinds. There's a heat pump water heater that's a little more common right now. It looks very much like a regular tanked water heater that you might find in your basement, but it's got a little compressor on the top. And it uses the air normally inside your home garage to heat up the water. So that's pretty standard for what I call domestic hot water use, your showers, your hand washing, your clothes washing. The way the person asked the question, I think they were actually asking more about what's on the right side of this image, which is a debadge, because we don't want to recommend any specific products, but an example of an air to water heat pump for space conditioning purposes. And so the U.S. Department of Energy has some resources more on the heat pump water side. The air to water heat pumps is kind of the key term if you want to look at some of the offerings in the space. They're very popular in Europe and they're growing here in the US, but it's still pretty early days for like widespread adoption. But basically, it works like an air conditioner or a regular heat pump that you might use for space conditioning, but instead of basically heating up a refrigerant that then heats up air that gets blown around a house, you're instead heating up water or a refrigerant and then water. And that water is what's used to circulate. And the reason the person probably brought this up is this is an option if you're trying to decarbonize, especially a boiler system. It's a little less, today, if you have a furnace and you're trying to put in a heat pump, it's a pretty straight one-to-one swap. Generally talk to your contractor, all that stuff. But if you've got a boiler, it's a little more complicated because this domestic hot water heat pump water heater is not going to meet your demands unless you live in a very, very house with a very low heating demand. It really wasn't designed for that anyway. But these air to water heat pumps are really meant to deliver a lot more heat flow. They use the outside air to heat it. So I bring that up is to say the person was kind of asking, is this possible? And yes, it is. They exist. They're sold here in the U.S. Under a couple of different brands, but it's growing. And Mustafa, if we go to the next slide, I saw we have a question. I just want to finish this last one to make sure we can have time to get to Jill's question as well. There's also a different kind of, there's not really air to water heat pumps, but it's ground to water. But in essence, it's also kind of from the air, if you want to go deep on the physics with me. There's also, ground source or geothermal heat pumps, a couple of different options as well. So just wanted to, those can also go, from another source to water. And those have traditionally been the answer if you were trying to replace a boiler with a similar hydronic system or a water-based system. You go ground source. Now you can use these air source ones. So with that, I saw there was a question. Yeah, Tony, good question. I would say, so I think what we're looking for there is back to this word of additionality. Okay, somebody's note takers putting notes in the chat. Back to additionality. If that was already existing, then it might be harder to. I think what we're thinking is that might be, this was already done. I want to get credit for it now. That's not really adding to that, clean power. But if you put it in at the time of the install or a little before it, or I think in this case, if you installed something and then a year or two later you said, hey, I now am installing new, renewable generation that's dedicated to this piece of equipment, we could definitely, that's the kind of thing that we can credit, right? Like you are making actions that reduce the life cycle emissions. You wouldn't get credit for the first, say you were 5 years in to a heat pump and then you go install the solar. You wouldn't get credit for the first 5 years, but for the rest of that kind of expected lifetime matchup, that's something you get credit for. Does that answer your question, Tony?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. And with 5 minutes left, let's get to the last one. Citing opportunities and challenges for the clean energy transition. That's what I've titled this slide because we've had a lot of questions about concerns both with the siting of potential biorefineries to make these fuels, as well as solar and how that all works out. So a little bit of background, biorefineries, like things that produce are large sources of direct emissions because the refining process requires that. Those are permitted air sources in Maryland. So that does go through MDE in building that refinery. Like that is a thing that does happen. And MDE has existing processes for that. So that's kind of our general response on the kind of biorefinery siting side of things. We do though want, we want to grow the industry for alternative fuels here in Maryland. Like that is part of the goal here. And so somebody suggested, well, could we co-locate an old, a new biorefinery with an old power plant? To me, that sounds like a win-win. It's a brownfield site. It's probably not going to be redeveloped for other things. Like those are the kinds of things that get considered in the permitting process. So I just, wanted to raise that as I thought that was some great suggestions that somebody was thinking about as they submitted it. All right, and now this gets into the solar. I saw, so Jill was asking about solar used on farmland when evaluating the impacts. So this goes into part of this question again of how detailed we can go with this kind of life cycle emissions analysis. So GREET as its attributional core model is pretty standard, right? These are the assumptions you take into account. You can put in these land use change factors, so that can be incorporated in, and that's about as far as we go. We did do a bunch of digging because we've gotten a bunch of questions about this on, what's happening in this space. And 1 second, let me get a sip of water. But the things that we have found are basically that there's not actually what we found. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture put out a study last year that said so far only about 0.05% of farmland that's currently used for solar, 0.05% of farmland is currently used for solar. So it's a very, very small portion. And even when that's happening, 85% of that farmland is still actually being used for crop and pasture rangeland after the panels are being installed. So what they're seeing is solar might be going in, but there's still some sort of crop or pasture being raised on a lot of those solar farms. You might have sheep grazing, you might have a cover crop being grown underneath, or some other crop growing. Agrivoltaics has been something that's like, it's a relatively new term. It's really still being developed and studied, but yet actually what's happening is this is one of these cases, it seems, where a lot of farmers are ahead of the curve. They're doing solar or wind, as the study was looking at, as an additional revenue stream to not replace their replace their crop, but to kind of augment it in certain parts or in corners of fields, a few different changes. So, what we saw when we did the analysis is actually that in most cases, these emissions are actually a bit of a wash. There might be some additional, the emissions reductions from that solar are offsetting that carbon sink capacity that might be lost within the first year of operation. So that was what we were finding as we, as we were digging into this. So that's kind of where we're feeling like, well, GREET has the standard factors. Let's just keep in that GREET standard factor realm, when the data is out there showing us that it seems to be coming out mostly a wash. But Jill, that's what we found.
Yeah, this is Jill. I just wanted to add to that. That's great. I'm happy to hear that it may not impact the farmers, because that is a revenue stream for them potentially. But also, I have seen cases where swaths of forests have been cut down to put up solar. How are you guys going to be actually looking at that, or is that not something you're going to factor in?
I think so far as it goes into the default assumptions, and when we get into the default assumptions, we can look at them a little more closely. But it's not something we're, say, adding additional, an additional adder or consideration in. But like, to the broader point, like, that is part of what's going into the kind of electricity mix analysis, is the life cycle emissions impact. So that all kind of gets put into the stew there, so to speak. Does that answer your question, Jill?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
All righty. Mustafa, we can go to the end here. If we advance, we are at time, so we will save other topics for a next meeting, probably at the end of September or early October. We already have one topic to discuss, raised of the carbon capture. But if you have other topics that you want to dive into some more, you felt like we need more time to discuss after today, or you want to come back, digest, feel free to shoot us an email at the Clean Heat email. And I'll turn it back over to Mustafa to wrap us out.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. And as we decide on a date and flesh out our agenda a little bit more for next meeting, we will be sending that to everyone here promptly as well. If you are unable to attend next session, of course, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube playlist. And contact information for our teams can be found on this slide over here. We'll just give everyone a quick minute to scan the QR codes if they wish. But thank you all for attending this afternoon, and we will see you all next time.